Hey, good afternoon. We had a pretty heavy rainstorm in the Northeast yesterday and into this morning. And we've been talking about soil and carbon capture and everything else. And then one of the questions that came up was, where does all that rainwater go? What happens? It's a great question. So based on the rainfall that we had, this area here got about 550,000 gallons of water ended up here. So where does that water go? And that's one of the conversations that we're having about our soil health. So here's just a little sample of the soil. We're definitely on the way of improvement, but and you can't see it here because of course I'm in a video, but this is dry and it should be wet. And what's happening, 550,000 gallons of water. Think about how much water that is that ended up on here. So where does it go? And what are we trying to accomplish? Well, what happens is it runs off. Now, as it runs off, it takes with it this good soil that I've got. It takes that top-soil away. If somebody's fertilizing with a synthetic fertilizer, it takes that away. All those things. If you're spraying some sort of herbicide or pesticide, it takes it away. So all of that is then running off and ending up in our lakes and our streams and our waterways and all of that. That's where it goes. So in our case, our water is going to run down. We actually have kind of a swale there. It takes a runoff. There's some of it that goes underneath the road through a culvert, and it ends up in a little pond over on that side. I'm going to have other stuff that's going to come down the other field, and then it's going to run down into our pond. And so we see with heavy rains, we got a lot of silt ends up in the pond, and we'll see that there. And we see it really everywhere, and this is how they get those bacteria warnings and they get the blooms. So if you fertilize, if you're using a synthetic fertilizer and you go down there and you throw a lot of nitrogen on because you think that's what you're supposed to do, and that's what they tell us to do, that nitrogen gets into a waterway, and all of a sudden we can get a real bad algae bloom, because that's what that's going to cause. We get into places with manure and they use a slurry, and that washes off, and then that goes down, and it really creates some issues. But it's all about the fact that the soil can't hold the water and it can't capture it. And imagine all this water that's running off, if we were capturing it and putting it in the water, and then when we do have dry conditions, it's not an issue because we're capturing that and it's not ending up. So where does it end up? It really goes back into storm drains and ends up in the ocean. In fact, they talked about out west in California, when they had those big torrential rains and all that drought, that about 95% of that rainwater ended up back in the Pacific Ocean. So it just cycles itself around. So here in New England, it's going to end up out in the Atlantic. It'll end up by here. We have Lake Winnipesaukee is going to get water from it. Our ponds are going to get water from it, and they're going to fill up. And we see that happen. We had a big heavy rain earlier this year at about 4 inches, and it literally ends up over our spillway. That spillway leads down into Goose Pond, and it ends up there, and it just keeps moving downstream. But think about what it picks up along the way, and that's really the challenge of this runoff. It takes the topsoil with it. It's going to pick up any sort of pesticides, herbicide, any of that sort of stuff that you're using, and it's just going to get washed downstream. So we see houses built on the lakefront, beautiful lawns and all that, and if they're using a nitrogen fertilizer, that's getting washed up. It's ending up in their lake or their pond, and they're challenging that. We have a lot of septic systems up here in New Hampshire. If some of those are failing or not doing really good, that's getting washed into the pond, and all of a sudden we're closing ponds because of this. So getting the soil healthy is really critical, and that's what we're really aiming after, because here we have all this rain and we didn't capture it and it got away, and then all of a sudden we're going to be complaining later that we don't have the rain water to take care of our crops and whatever else we're growing and taking care of. So that is the whole thing. But that's the answer to the question, where does it go? It's going to end right up back in the ocean through this or the lakes and streams is where it ends up. So it's all about that watershed runoff, and what is it that we're picking up on the way that ends up into our ponds and our lakes. That's what I got for you today. So again, think about what you put down because it's going to end up right where you're swimming or drinking.